Hey everyone! Before we get started tonight, let's briefly review the last two sessions. 2 times ago, we learned about what socio-historical context is and why it's so important. 1 time ago, we talked about the difference between biblical inerrancy and biblical inspiration. Those 2 themes are going to come up tonight as we transition to looking at the first part of the Old Testament, the Torah. So the Torah refers to the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Torah, when translated literally, means the law, but for the Jewish people, it is so much more than that. The Torah encapsulates their Jewish identity and is a deeply sacred part of their religion. If you've been through confirmation, you've gone to the United Hebrew congregation just up the road, and you've seen this next thing. So when you go to Jewish places of worship, they actually keep large handmade Torah scrolls at the front of their sanctuary, prominently displayed in a similar place where we would put a cross. It is that important, so we need to keep our Jewish siblings respectfully in mind as we discuss this sacred text of theirs. So the Torah, when broken down, has 3 main components. 1, the beginning of the world and the beginning of Judaism. 2, genealogies, and what these do is they connect Adam and Eve all the way to the other Jewish patriarchs. And 3, the Exodus story and the law, which includes the 10 commandments and the 600 laws that expand upon it. So those 3 components point to one common theme: covenant. Now, a covenant by strict definition means agreement, but the covenant God makes with us in the Torah is so much more than that. It's God's promise that He will protect us and never leave us. Most importantly, this covenant was initiated by God. God sought us out to enter into a relationship with us. So let's unpack these 3 components. Number 1, the stories about the beginning of the world are those ancient primeval stories at the beginning of Genesis, such as creation, the flood, the Tower of Babel, etc. You have versions of these stories in every major religion, and then they shift and become about the start of Judaism, which begins with Abraham. Okay, so when I was growing up, I always sang the song at church and like Vacation Bible School, Father Abraham. I don't know if you guys know it, but it's Father Abraham had many sons had Father Abraham. And you get your arms and your legs going, I am one of them, and so are you. So let's all praise the Lord. So it's a song about like we are all descendants of Abraham. So it's telling us that we are part of the covenant that God started with Abraham so many years ago. So now you know. So God enters into a covenant with Abraham and his wife Sarah and promises He will always be their God and stick by them. In other words, He promises to be in relationship with them. And then Abraham has kids, and then his kids have kids, and so on and so forth, and the covenant grows larger and larger, finally forming the nation of Israel. Component number 2. So while this is all happening, we see genealogies kind of sprinkled throughout. So like Adam had this son, who had this son, who had this son, and you can't pronounce any of their names. It's impossible. And these genealogies tie these people and these stories together, leading to Abraham, and then Moses, and then eventually all the way to Jesus. So if you've ever picked up the Bible and tried to start at the beginning and read all the way through, this is likely the part where you gave up. Because, wow, why include all of this ridiculously boring stuff? So the reason why is the idea of descendancy was really important. Very similar to how we think of royal lineage. Like not just anybody gets to have the title of king and queen, you have to be born into the family to be royalty. So when you look back at the covenant God made with Abraham and his family, if you could show that Moses was tied to him, it legitimized them as leaders and was the sign that the covenant was still in play. So now for component number 3, Exodus and the law. Here we learn that Egypt came to enslave the Israelites, which brings us the story of Moses. And we know the basics of this story, right? He is an Israelite slave born in Egypt who, as a baby, escaped the decree that all firstborns be killed. His family floats him down the river where he is found by Pharaoh's wife, who raises him in their palace. He grows up, has compassion for his people, kills an Egyptian slave master, and then runs away to be a shepherd. Later on, God calls him by the burning bush and calls him back to Egypt to set the Israelites free. After some hesitation, he agrees, goes back, frees them using the 10 scary plagues and leads them out of Egypt. God miraculously parts the Red Sea so they can cross safely and be free people once and for all. And then they wander in the desert for 40 years. Yay, freedom. And then, of course, several thousand years later, we make a really long movie about it starring Charlton Heston, which was actually really good when it was made, but now the special effects are just kind of laughable, which I guess is how our grandchildren are going to think of the Marvel movies. Oh, okay, yeah, no, this is not okay. Oh, okay, so got a little off track there. Back to the Torah. During those 40 years, God reveals the 10 Commandments and over time, about 600 additional laws. While some of these additional laws are very specific and very confusing when read by someone living in the 21st century, when you boil down these laws and understand them in the context in which they're written, they are all about how to be in a right relationship with God, our neighbors, and nature. Sound familiar? This is the covenant in action again. God is saying, if I'm going to be your God and you're going to be my people, we need to put some boundaries on this relationship. God is not only staying in the relationship, but God's also teaching us how to do the same. So the story of Moses takes us all the way through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, so the end of the Torah. At the end of Deuteronomy, after 40 years in the desert, the Israelites have reached the Promised Land. Moses, somewhat ironically, dies right before they get there, so at the end of Torah, they have a huge transition. Their leader changes to Moses' brother Aaron, and their home changes from wandering nomads to a permanent settlement. So again, how we read these stories in Torah matters so much. When we look at socio-historical context and learn that Levitical law came about as people were wandering in the desert for generations after being enslaved for generations, that matters. We're going to read those laws with a different perspective, and that changes how we understand and respond to it. Their world looks almost nothing like ours does today. There are some famous Levitical laws out there that Christians really like to read out of context and then throw them around and use them to clobber others and say, you are sinning. It's irresponsible and it's downright dangerous to read the Bible that way. Remember, the laws were given so that we could be in a loving relationship with God and each other. It's a love story, not a list of arbitrary rules that we have to follow or else we go to hell. At the same time, we can still learn a whole lot of timeless messages from these 5 books that are super relevant to life in 2021. The big one, of course, being that God did not break the covenant and abandon the Israelites, and in the same way, he will not break it with us. God is still here with us. He never left us, and he never will. I hear stories often about people losing their faith when they go through something difficult. How could a God still be here when all this bad stuff is happening? It's a question that, of course, comes from a deep place of pain. When we read the Bible, really read it and really get familiar with it, we learn that God does not abandon us when things get hard. Y'all, 40 years in the desert means that everyone who was actually a slave in Egypt died in the desert. Their kids and their grandkids are the ones who made it to the Promised Land. I can't imagine spending the first half of my life as a slave under brutal pharaohs, and then spending the second and final half without a stable home to call my own, and then dying. When you think about it that way, no wonder they were such a mess in the desert, and they needed so many laws just to keep them from imploding. I think we would all be in that same boat. But that's what happened, and God did not abandon them, and likewise, whatever we experience in our lives in just the same way, God will not abandon us. So, that is the lesson on the Torah. Hope y'all learned something today, and that y'all have a great discussion with your small groups. Bye.